Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 13th ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The Journey of Humanity, the Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Our speaker is Professor Oded Galor, the Herbert Goldberger Professor of Economics at the Brown University. He's the founder of Unified Growth Theory. He has contributed to understanding the economic development process over the entire course of human history and the role of deep-rooted factors in the transition from stagnation to growth and the emergence of vast inequality across the globe. He has pioneered the exploration of the interaction between human adaptation and economic development and of the impact of evolutionary processes, population diversity, biogeographical forces, and inequality on the process of development over most of human existence. He is an elected fellow of the Economies Society, a co-director of the MBR Research Group on Income Distribution and Macroeconomics, a research fellow of CEPR, GLOW, and ISA, a research associate of the NBR and CESIFO, a secular fellow at Tel Aviv University, and a fellow of the Economics Department at the Hebrew University. He has published widely in top scientific journals. He's the author of 3 best-selling books, Discrete Dynamical System, Unified Growth Theory, and The Journey of Humanity, the Origins of Wealth and Inequality, that has been just published. Today, Oded will tell us about the origins of wealth and inequality. While the evolution of technology has been a gradual process, accelerating over time, living standards have not followed a similar path. The ancient inequality of life since the early 19th century has been the outcome of an abrupt transformation. How Western societies broke out of the Malthusian poverty trap, that is the mystery of growth, lies in the interplay of the Industrial Revolution, rising education, and falling fertility rates. Geographical, institutional, cultural, and societal factors are behind the different timing with which the various areas in the world experience this liberation, and therefore the exploding worldwide inequality meanwhile. The prosperity that has continued until now is currently under threat from environmental degradation and climatic change. The opportunity window to make the human journey sustainable, avoiding the worst consequences of climatic change, is still open. But there is no time to lose. Without further ado, Oded, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to address this wide audience and to share insights that I generated over the past few decades with a broad audience. So my lecture will be devoted to a recent book that was just released a week ago, The Journey of Humanity, the Origins of Wealth and Inequality. And the book explores the evolution of human societies since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. And much of it surrounds 2 of the most fundamental mysteries that surrounds this journey. The first one is the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 2 centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation. And the second one is the mystery of inequality, namely, what is the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations. Now, over most of human existence, human life was largely nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, humans were remarkably similar to any other species on planet Earth. They were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Their living standards was very close to subsistence, and there were minor differences in living standards across time and across space. In fact, only a few centuries ago, 1/4 of newborn died before reaching their first birthday, and 1/2 of them did not reach their reproductive age. About 1/10 of women perished during childbirth, and life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. But perhaps more striking, an economic crisis during this period did not lead into belt-tightening, it led into mass starvation and ultimately extinction. And then, suddenly, quite abruptly, in the past 2 centuries, we see an enormous metamorphosis, a remarkable transformation in living standards within and across societies. In fact, income per capita in the world economy increases 14-fold. Life expectancy has more than doubled, and a great variation started to emerge in income per capita across countries and regions of the world. Now, to better grasp this dramatic transformation, consider for a moment residents of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, Roman Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and place these individuals in a time machine and move them forward in time to Ottoman-ruled Jerusalem at the 19th century. Now, despite this 2,000 years jump, these individuals will be able to adapt instantaneously to the new environment. In fact, past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental. Occupations would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would remain largely unchanged. But now, take these individuals and place them again in a time machine and move them this time forward only 200 years. Despite this relatively small movement in time, these individuals will be entirely lost. They will be entirely devastated. This will be a shocking experience. Past knowledge would be largely obsolete. Technologies would appear as witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skills, and life expectancy would instantaneously double. And as a result of it, would require a complete reorientation of individuals, would require a future-oriented mindset, education decisions, saving decisions, life cycle decisions. So something very dramatic occurred in the world economy in the past 200 years after literally 300,000 years of near stagnation. Now, in contrast to some conventional wisdom, living standards has not increased gradually in the course of human history. Technological progress accelerated gradually over time, but nevertheless, it had a negligible impact on living standards over most of human history. And what we see most recently reflect what I will define as a phase transition, namely an abrupt transformation that occurred once a tipping point has been reached. Now, to visualize this metamorphosis, consider the evolution of income per capita in the world in the past 2,000 years. As you can see in the graph in front of you, over most of human existence, living standards were very close to the subsistence. We see some fluctuations around the subsistence level, typical Malthusian fluctuations, but no significant trend. And then, in the course of the past 2 centuries, we see this enormous eruption, a 14-fold increase in income per capita on average in the world, where some of the regions are experiencing a 50-fold increase and a 100-fold increase. In fact, if I would have removed the axis from this table, and I would show this figure to an outsider, most outsiders would assume that this is in fact a figure that reflects tectonic activities, major eruption that occurs at a certain point in the course of human history. But this is not tectonic eruptions. This is in fact the eruption in income per capita, this enormous metamorphosis that occurred in the past 200 years. Now, interestingly enough, when these metamorphoses occur, does not occur at the same time period across the globe. Some regions of the world are experiencing this takeoff 200 years ago and even earlier. Others only very recently. And as a result of it, an enormous divergence is taking place between countries and regions of the world in the past 200 years. Now, naturally, when we consider these two fundamental mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality, it is quite apparent that the resolution of these mysteries would require the identification of the forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth, would require the identification of the forces that govern the differential timing of the transition across the globe, and would require a better understanding of the role of historical and prehistorical forces in generating barriers in the process of development. And naturally, the resolution of these mysteries would provide us with important insights about the design policies and strategies that can mitigate inequality across the globe. Now, based on this analysis, it is quite apparent that in fact, much of the inequality that we see across the globe today was originated in the distant past. It is partly associated with the differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth. But naturally, this differential timing in turn is associated with historical and prehistorical forces that generated barriers in the process of development in some societies and were catalysts for the process of development in others. And consequently, in order to resolve the mystery of growth initially, and ultimately to attempt to resolve the mystery of inequality, we will have to consider the entire span of human history. When we think about the evolution of societies, as I said, since the emergence of modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago, one can segment the process of development into three fundamental phases: the Malthusian epoch, the post-Malthusian regime, and the modern growth regime. Now, the Malthusian epoch originates at the time of the emergence of modern humans in Africa, nearly 300,000 years ago. And it spends 99.9% of human existence till about the eve of industrialization in the context of the most advanced societies in the world. Now, the Malthusian epoch is a very interesting time period, in the sense that it is characterized by important dualism. On the one hand, stagnation in income per capita, stagnation in life expectancy, but on the other hand, great dynamism in technology, population, and human adaptation that ultimately permits the world to take off into the post-Malthusian regime. During the post-Malthusian regime, the relationship between income and population is still positive, namely richer people have higher reproductive success. But ultimately, towards the end of the 19th century, in the context of the most developed countries in the world is experiencing a demographic transition. And the growth process is being freed from the counterbalancing effect of population, and the world is sailing towards the modern growth regime. So as I hinted, the resolution of the mystery of growth and the resolution of the mystery of inequality would require better understanding of the latent forces that operated during the Malthusian epoch. So as I said earlier, the Malthusian epoch is characterized by fascinating dualism. On the one hand, stagnation, but on the other hand, dynamism. We see stagnation in living standards, the sense that income per capita, largely speaking, is fluctuating around the subsistence level with very minor trend. And life expectancy fluctuated in a narrow range of 25 to 40. But at the same time, during this Malthusian epoch, we see dynamism. Dynamism in technology, dynamism in population, and dynamism in human adaptation. Now, at any point in time, this dynamism is relatively small, almost negligible. But over 300,000 year period, it makes an enormous difference. In the context of technology, 300,000 years ago, humans are employing stone tool technology. And naturally, in the eve of the industrialization, they hold already steam engine technology. Think about the population of planet Earth. The population of planet Earth in the eve of the agricultural revolution is about 2.5 million people. The population of the world at the time of industrialization is close to 1 billion. Namely, despite Malthusian stagnation, we do see an incredible dynamism in the population of the world and a 400-fold increase over this 12,000 year period between the onset of the agricultural revolution and the onset of the industrial revolution. And it is this dynamism in the Malthusian epoch that is ultimately rescuing the world from the arms of the Malthusian octopus. So it is important to understand the building blocks and the main forces that are operating in the Malthusian epoch. And there are 3 of them. The first one is the impact of technology on population. During the Malthusian epoch, we see some technological progress. And when technology advances, naturally, income per capita increases, at least in the short run. Why is it the case? People are employing better seeds, better fertilizers, better plows, and as a result of it, in the end of the year, the yield is higher than otherwise. But this greater yield permits families to sustain larger families. Less of their children die, more of their children are born, and as a result of it, population grows. And population continues to grow as long as income is above subsistence. And consequently, income per capita inevitably reverted back to its long-run position. And consequently, very important testable implications are generated from this mechanism, namely, technologically advanced societies and land-rich economies had higher population density, but very similar levels of income per capita. And in fact, the data is supporting it quite strongly. If you think about the association between land productivity and population density in the year 1500, then not surprisingly, more productive places in terms of soil quality have higher population density. But the astonishing element is that higher land productivity is not converted into higher income per capita in the same year, the year 1500. Similarly, societies that benefit from more advanced technologies have higher population density in the year 1500. But nevertheless, the same societies have the same level of income per capita. So this is one important building block in the context of the wheels of change that are operating during the Malthusian epoch. The second important building block is the effect of technological progress on human adaptation. So as I just suggested, the Malthusian epoch and the Malthusian pressure affected the size of the population. But at the same time, it affected the composition of the population due to the adaptation of the population to the Malthusian pressure. So naturally, during this time period, traits that were complementary to the growth process generated higher income and, in a Malthusian world, higher reproductive success. This implies that they became more prevalent in the population over time. And this adaptation, therefore, raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the growth process, reinforced the growth process, and reinforced the takeoff from stagnation to growth. Okay, so this is the second wheel of change, the second catalyst of the transition from stagnation to growth. And the third element has to do with the origins of technological progress. And it is the size of the population and the composition of the population that foster technological progress over this time period. The size of the population affected the supply of innovations, more people, more innovators. The size of the population affected the demand for innovations, more people, more demand for innovations. It affected the diffusion of knowledge, the division of labor, and the extent of trade, and via reverse engineering, technological progress. So these are the three fundamental wheels of change that are rotating in the Malthusian epoch and are ultimately rescuing the world from the arms of the Malthusian octopus. So during the Malthusian epoch, the size of the population and the composition of the population affected technological progress. More people, more adapted people, faster technological progress. The technological progress in turn affected the size of the population and the composition of the population. More advanced technology supported more people and generated further adaptation. And in the course of human history, these wheels of change rotated at a faster and faster pace, reinforcing interaction between the size of the population, the composition of the population, and technological progress. And ultimately, technological acceleration was so rapid. As I said earlier, the movement from stone tool technology to steam engine technology, that technological progress reached a critical threshold beyond which human capital became essential in permitting individuals to adapt to the technological environment. The technological landscape changed so rapidly that human capital became essential to allow individuals to navigate this stormy environment. But naturally, human capital formation is not manna from heaven. It is costly. And it is costly at the parental level. And consequently, human capital formation brought about a fertility decline. Families had limited budget. They prioritized education more than before, and consequently, they had to economize on the size of the family. But this was critical because naturally, this Malthusian relationship between income and population, income is rising, population is rising, suddenly was removed. And as a result of it, the Malthusian equilibrium simply vanished. And the world gravitated towards the modern growth regime. Namely, the growth process was freed from the counterbalancing effect of population. And consequently, this holy triangle, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth all contributed to the movement into the sustained growth regime. To visualize the idea, think about these three wheels of change: the size of the population, the composition of the population, and technological progress. So as I said, humanity starts somewhere in Africa 300,000 years ago, certain level of population. Sooner or later, people innovate. Technology is being advanced. The advancement in technology permits more human to be supported. And at the same time, it generates human adaptation. Both these forces, human adaptation and larger population, foster even faster technological progress. And in the course of human history, these wheels of change are reinforcing one another. Ultimately, the world is reaching a critical point in which the pace of technological progress is so rapid that human capital becomes essential to cope with the rapidly changing technological environment. Note that over all human existence, there is a gradual increase in the latent return to human capital, but it is so small and so low that individuals do not invest in human capital, certainly not in mass education, But ultimately, the world is reaching a critical point, mass education is enacted, and consequently, we see a phase transition. The demographic transition takes place, the Malthusian equilibrium vanishes, and the world is converging into the modern growth regime. Now, it is important to keep the analogy between this transition of humanity from the agricultural stage of development to the modern growth regime and the transition from water to gas. So as you know, when we boil water, gradually we see changes in water molecules. Initially, it appears that the water is calm, but once we reach a critical level, we see the transition from one state, liquid, to another state, which is gas. The same was true in the course of human history. Over most of human existence, we see a gradual increase in the rate of technological progress and a gradual increase in the latent demand for human capital. And then, once this latent demand for human capital reaches a critical threshold, we have a phase transition. Namely, the Malthusian equilibrium vanished, and we are moving from one phase of development to another phase of development. But it is very important to note that precisely as we see in the context of the transition from water to gas, not all water molecules are evaporating at once. Some of them are evaporating earlier than otherwise. The same holds for countries, for nations, for regions. Some countries, some regions of the world are taking off early, others are taking off very late, and as a result of it, a huge divergence is occurring in the world economy. So when we think about my description of the evolution of societies in the course of human history, starting 300,000 years ago to the present, it appears that this evolution, to a large extent, is reflecting a march, the march of humanity that is perhaps unstoppable. In fact, we can consider what I will define as shattering and dreadful events in the course of the past century. Think about World War I, or World War II, or the Great Depression, or the Spanish flu, and most recently, consider the effect of COVID-19. Despite these dreadful events, and despite the fact that humanity in the short run was devastated greatly by these tragedies, ultimately, when we focus on the grand arc of human development, it appears that in fact, the march of humanity was largely unaffected by this process. So the question is whether in fact recent crises that we face, say the humanitarian crisis now in Ukraine, will be a devastating phenomena that perhaps can derail humanity from its current course. And again, the journey of humanity, the book, and the journey of humanity in essence, is providing us with, in fact, very optimistic outlook, suggests that these incredible tragedies and these horrific events that are taking place in Europe at the moment are not going to be long-lasting and are not going to derail humanity from its long march. But nevertheless, the question remains whether climate change, in fact, will be the single factor that will derail humanity from its relentless march forward. And here again, the journey of humanity provides a very hopeful look. But when you think about climate change at the moment, naturally, much of it is originated in the process of technological acceleration that brought about industrialization, industrial pollution, and climate change. But at the same time, this technological acceleration is associated with human capital formation, mass education that occurs as a result of it, and the power of innovation. And in fact, only very recently, we could witness and benefit from this power of innovation in the context of COVID-19. Naturally, if we think about the world 100 years ago under COVID-19, the pandemic would have lasted for perhaps decades and longer, and the devastation would have been enormous. And here we are, the power of innovation permitted the development of mRNA technologies that rescue the world from these potential long-term consequences. Now, at the same time, this acceleration in technological progress brought about an additional important factor. And this important factor is, in fact, the decline in fertility rate. Why is it so important? Because the decline in fertility rate, and one case in point, is the fact that India just dropped below replacement level in terms of fertility. The importance of this fertility decline is that it mitigates the pace of climate change. It is humans that are polluting, and consequently, the sharp reduction in fertility and the forecasted decline in population growth will mitigate the current trend of climate change and will allow us to buy some time for the development of revolutionary technologies that would permit humanity to overcome this crisis. And ultimately, based on the past, it appears this power of innovation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the decline in fertility would permit us to turn this climatic crisis into a fading memory, perhaps in the coming decades or in the coming century. Again, conditional on not being complacent, conditional on being very vigorous, conditional on using the entire power of innovation to initially implement environmentally friendly technologies and ultimately developing this revolutionary technology that we cannot envision at the moment that will reverse the current pattern of climate change. So when you think about the first part of the book is basically resolving the mystery of growth. It starts with the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa 300,000 years ago and march all the way to the present. Basically identify the wheels of change that brought about the dramatic transformation in living standards and brought about the prosperity that is present in much of the world. But as I said earlier, this takeoff from stagnation to growth was associated with huge divergence in income per capita across countries and across regions. And this leads us into the second mystery, the mystery of inequality. What are the roots of this dramatic inequality in the wealth of nations? And as I said earlier, it is quite apparent that much of the inequality that we see across the globe today is originated in this differential timing of the transition, and this differential timing in turn is rooted in deep factors that emerge in the distant past. So naturally, initially, when economists were tackling the issue of inequality in the wealth of nations, they're attracted by what can be defined as the proximate causes of uneven development. Cross-country differences in human capital formation, in physical capital formation, or in technological level. But this doesn't take us very far, because naturally, the question is why some society fail to invest efficiently in physical and human capital? Or why some society fail to adopt and to advance new technologies. So this leads us into deeper roots of development. And in the second part of the book, I'm in fact reversing the time clock. I'm starting at the present and looking at different layers of influence, starting with the contemporary inequality, focusing on colonialism, institutions, culture, geography, and human diversity. So when we think about deep roots of comparative development, as I said, historical and prehistorical forces, then it is important to note that institutional and cultural characteristics are very important for the understanding of comparative development. But nevertheless, these factors are themselves predicated on deeper roots, ultimate roots, namely geographical factors and societal characteristics. So let's start with the initial layer. I will define as the fingerprints of institutions. So naturally, at a certain point in the course of human history, we see the emergence of differential institutions across the globe. We see the emergence of growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions in some regions, and we see the emergence of growth-retarding, extractive institutions in others. But naturally, institutions are rarely manna from heaven. Institutions typically adapt to the economic environment, to the geographical environment, to the social environment, to the cultural environment. Yes, we can identify some critical junctures that can be defined as random that somehow bifurcate development based on institutions. And there are a few prominent cases of this sort. For instance, the impact of the Black Death on the decimation of the European population, scarcity of labor, and ultimately demand for labor in the urban sector. It is basically putting pressure on the landed elite and generating a decline in feudalism, as we saw in the UK. And this decline in feudalism in the UK could have contributed ultimately to the emergence of property rights and ultimately to industrialization. Another important critical juncture is perhaps the Glorious Revolution and its impact on the emergence of constitutional monarchy and industrialization in England. And perhaps the most striking example is the division of the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel. It is basically generating a communist hell in the north and a semi-Western heaven in the south. But as I said earlier, institutions mostly evolve gradually in the course of human history. The Neolithic revolution brought about an increase in population density, and as a result of it, the demand for institutions that would permit cooperation, that would permit the cohesiveness of the society, that would permit the implementation of important public goods. Suitability of land for large plantations generated large concentration of land ownership. It ultimately lobbied for the implementation of extractive institutions and the horrific institutions of slavery. And the disease environment, broadly speaking, generated underdevelopment and delayed adoption of centralized institutions. So again, institutions are important, but they're not manna from heaven. They are predicated on earlier conditions, geographical conditions, and human diversity that ultimately led into the demand and implementation of these institutions. So once we peel this layer of institutions, we can look deeper at the cultural factor. And again, we see the emergence of differential cultural traits across regions. We see the emergence of growth-enhancing cultural traits, such as social capital, in some parts of the world. And we see the emergence of growth-retarding cultural traits, such as family ties in other parts of the world. And for instance, the Italian divide can be perhaps mapped into these differential cultural traits between the North and the South. But again, cultural traits are rarely manna from heaven. So why do we see social capital in the North and family ties in the South of Italy? There are, again, critical junctures in which we can identify random growth-enhancing cultural mutations. And perhaps the best example is the emergence of mandatory literacy in Judaism in the 1st century CE. And this occurs in the course or in the aftermath of the destruction of the Jewish temple and the emergence of a scholarly group that is emphasizing literacy, not necessarily for economic benefits, but because of religious reasons. And this mutation, cultural mutation, is ultimately persisting over time because human capital ultimately becomes incredibly beneficial in the urban environment, became incredibly beneficial in a population that migrated from one place to another. This was a portable asset that one could invest in. But this is quite rare. We can think about the Protestant Reformation and its emphasis on thrift and entrepreneurship. And naturally, this had a tremendous impact on the spirit of capitalism, if we wish. But naturally, the Protestant Reformation is really not manna from heaven. It occurs in the context of religious competition at the time. And in this respect, it's really responding to the environment. But more importantly, when we think about culture, culture largely evolved and adapted to the environment in which people operated. When there was an increase in the return to human capital, we see a gradual increase in the predisposition towards child quality. When the return to agricultural production, to the agricultural investment was larger than otherwise, people were engaged in planting and harvesting. They learned how to delay gratification, and this contributed to the formation of future-oriented mindset. When the environment was very volatile, this volatility led into the formation of different forms of loss aversion and entrepreneurial spirit. And when the environment was receptive for the use of the plow and plow was adopted, it generated a division of labor and gender biases that persisted over time. So again, geography explains much of the variations in cultural traits that we see across the globe. So this moves us into the next layer of influence, namely the shadow of geography. Geographical characteristics such as soil quality, climate, the disease environment, and isolation had a direct impact on labor productivity, human capital formation, trade, and technological progress. But in addition, importantly, they had an indirect impact on the evolution of cultural and institutional characteristics. As we continue to peel layers of influence, deep-rooted factors of development, we are led ultimately into the legacy of the Neolithic revolution that occurred as early as 12,000 years ago. So the transition of societies from hunter and gatherer tribes to agricultural communities led to the emergence of a non-food producing class. It was associated with knowledge creation in the form of science, in the form of technology, and in the form of written languages. And the technological head start that was created by this knowledge elite ultimately permitted certain societies to dominate over time. So the argument that was raised by Diamond was that the variation in the timing of the Neolithic revolution across the globe are behind the variation in prosperity across the globe. In fact, empirical evidence shows us that the Diamond hypothesis is very relevant for the past, namely till about the year 1500, but it is mute in the context of the contemporary variations in income per capita. And the reason is very simple. Comparative advantage in agriculture, or the transition to agriculture, generated on the one hand precisely what Diamond suggested, technological head start, but it generated comparative advantage in agriculture. Since agriculture has limited technological spillover, ultimately in the modern world, in the post-1500 period, it was a liability that offset the benefits of the technological head start. So again, the Neolithic revolution will be very important in understanding comparative development till about the year 1500, but not at the present. So this leads us back, in fact, as deeply as we can, back to Africa and to the migration of individuals out of Africa 60 to 90,000 years ago. Now, this migration had a great impact on population diversity across the globe and consequently comparative development. So what we see across the globe is the following. During this exodus of modern humans from Africa, departing populations carried only a subset of the diversity of their parental colonies. And this diversity could be cultural, phenotypic, behavioral, or linguistic. And since migration was sequential, the further people migrated, the lower was the degree of diversity. So if the population started somewhere here in Africa with a certain degree of diversity and migrated into the Fertile Crescent, certain diversity was lost in this migration. This is very simple. This is basically sampling from a limited distribution. The initial population is very small, the departing population is very small, and as a result of it, not representative. This population ultimately occupies the land till additional individuals are departing in a search for a more fertile land, some to Europe, others to Asia and to the America, and as they move further and further, the degree of diversity is declining. And in fact, the evidence is striking. If you look at migratory distance from Africa measured in tens of thousands of kilometers, the further individuals are from Africa, the less diverse these populations are. So the most diverse population that we have are in Africa, followed by the Middle Eastern population, European population, Asian population, Oceanian population, and the least diverse populations are in the Americas. And as I said, this is true regardless of how you measure diversity. Any measure of diversity will generate precisely the same pattern. Now, why is it so important? It is important because diversity has conflicting implications for productivity and for prosperity. On the one hand, diversity stimulates creativity and innovations because it generates cross-fertilization of ideas and complementarities in the production process. But on the other hand, it generates an adverse effect on social cohesiveness, namely mistrust, disagreement about the desirable public goods, and consequently conflicts. So there are conflicting effects of diversity. And if in fact there are positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations and positive and diminishing effects of diversity on, of homogeneity on social cohesiveness, this implies that one should expect hump-shaped relationship between diversity and development. Namely, societies that are overly diverse and overly homogeneous will perform less well than societies that have an intermediate level of diversity. And the evidence is striking in this respect. If you look at the world in the year 1500, in panel A, population density, which is a good measure of productivity at the time, we see this hump-shaped relationship. In panel B, urbanization, we see this sensational hump-shaped relationship. In panel C, contemporary income per capita, again, the same hump-shaped relationship, and luminosity in today's world, the same relationship. But one important element to consider, which is that as we move from the world in the year 1500 to today's world, the optimal level of diversity is changing. In the year 1500, societies that were close to the sweet spot of diversity, the one that balances the positive and the benefit of the adverse effect, were societies in East Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. But as we move into the current world and technology becomes much more demanding, the benefits of diversity are increasing gradually, and consequently, the level of diversity that is conducive to development is associated with the level of diversity in a place like the United States. And as we move further into the future, the prediction is that as we move into more demanding technological environment, the virtues of diversity will increase. And at the same time, since we started to educate our kids to be more tolerant, then the cost of diversity will be mitigated. And again, the optimal level of diversity will further increase. Now, this is true regardless of whether you focus on countries or ethnic groups. If you take all the ethnic groups in the ethnographic atlas, then you will see this sensational hump-shaped relationship, starting with 10,000 BCE, 5,000 BCE, 1,000 BCE to the present. Any data observation that one has in the past 12,000 years on population density is supporting this relationship. So, as I said before, when we think about the wheels of change, the size of the population, the composition of the population, and technological progress, they're rotating in the course of human history. But they're not rotating in a vacuum. They can be affected by institutional and cultural factors, certainly predisposition towards fertility, predisposition towards education, etc. But at the same time, they're affected by initial conditions, geography, and migratory distance from Africa. So in the course of human history, we see that these wheels of change are rotating in a different pace across the globe based on initial conditions. And ultimately, this takeoff from stagnation to growth that is occurring, and this phase transition is occurring in some societies much earlier than in others. Now, if you think about the importance of deep-rooted factors, then regression analysis suggests that nearly 90% of the variations in income per capita across the globe can be traced to deep-rooted factors. And if I will map them based on their depth, the dispersal of humans from Africa explains about 17 to 26 of the unexplained variations in income per capita across the globe today. Time since human settlement and the Neolithic revolution, about 3%. Geography, 27 to 38%. Disease ecology, 19 to 14%. The cultural factor, around 20%. And political institutions of the form of executive constraint, or as measured by 24, 3 to 9%. So there are many factors that are important for economic development. They're interacting in a very interesting way, and we should be aware of them in thinking about inequality across the globe. Now, let me conclude by one important discussion. And this is about historical determinism. Now, one concern may be that, in fact, given the fact that I'm identifying these deep-rooted factors in comparative development, the fate of nation is written in stone. This is, in fact, a misperception, fundamental misperception of what is done in this context. In fact, the insights from the journey of humanity, the book and the actual journey, is that the design of growth-enhancing, country-specific, history-specific policies are critical for the ability of humanity to flourish. But the important element is that we cannot work with the Washington consensus in which one policy fits all economies. In fact, the idea here is that once we understand the history of a particular society, of a particular economy, we can design a country-specific policy that will enable us to affect the future of this society. So let me give you a very quick example. Think about education policies. So naturally, the World Bank is advocating education and is advocating family planning. And these are wonderful policies. But resources are limited. Yes, we would like to spend resources in education, but what is the relevant curriculum? Is the curriculum universal across societies? No, it is history specific. If you think about a society that is very diverse, then naturally in society that is very diverse, the curriculum should target elements that are associated with social cohesiveness and tolerance. But if you take the other end of the spectrum. Homogeneous societies, there, the policy will be entirely different. The curriculum should be entirely different. There, I would like to educate people to challenge the status quo, to think out of the box, to foster pluralism. Alternatively, think about cultural traits that emerge in the context of human history based on geography. Policies that are fostering growth-enhancing cultural traits are very important. If in fact individuals are residing in a particular location where the geographical endowment was not conducive for the development of future-oriented mindset, then in this society, the curriculum should emphasize elements that can foster future-oriented mindset. For instance, the use of musical instruments as a way to cultivate and nourishment the ability to delay gratification. But it should be country-specific, not universal. The same about gender equality. If gender equality, as Bosarab suggested, is associated with the implementation of the plow in some societies and the lack of implementation in other societies, that again, in those societies was the plow where the plow was implemented relatively earlier, we should emphasize more than otherwise in the curriculum the importance of gender equality. So perhaps surprisingly, progressive policies, gender equality, tolerance, and diversity, all the key for human prosperity. And I'm saying perhaps surprisingly, because when we think typically about progressive policies, we think about the moral views behind them. But here I'm suggesting that much of them, in fact, are associated with economic efficiency and prosperity. Thank you very much.